I nibbled a piece of biscuit. A donkey kept fanning a cloud of flies into my face with its tail. My companions were as pensive as I. After all, there was something mysterious about the ease with which we had landed on the continent of Mount Analog. It still seemed certain that we had been expected. The path came out of the forest and wound down through bright, sunny clearings to the mountain torrent, which muttered and chuckled like an animated crowd. We crossed by a ford, stirring up clouds of iridescent butterflies from the damp bank, and crossed a wide, stony area without any shade. When we veered back to the right bank, an airy forest of larches began. The trail climbed up over a high, rocky promontory and turned to the right, where the valley narrowed into a deep gorge. Then the trail twisted pitilessly upward, back and forth across a steep scrub of junipers and rhododendrons. We finally came out in a high pasture, watered by countless little brooks, where some tubby cows were quietly grazing. 20 minutes of walking brought us through to a small pebbly plateau shaded by larches. There we found several stone buildings crudely covered with branches. It was our first night's stopping place. And so they realized that it seemed to have been inhabited. And Bernard, of course, tells them that it was lived in right up to this morning. There always has to be someone here. It's a regulation, they'll explain to you higher up. No encampment can ever remain unoccupied more than one day. The preceding caravan probably left a couple of men here and is waiting up ahead of us to arrive before going on. From here, the men could see us coming and must have left right away. We'll let them know we've arrived. And at the same time, I can show you where the base trail starts, because he cannot go any further. You see, he's taken them as far as he can. And as he says, in the mountains, a man becomes very attentive to any sign indicating the presence of one of his fellow men. So from where we stood, we could see about half of the second day's journey. Still could not see all the way. So they could then stay in this beautiful meadow brook, and it's there that they learn something of Bernard's story. And Bernard says that he had been there to Meadowbrook and somehow becomes lost from, or goes off on his own from the companions with whom he was traveling. And he says that the beginning of the story is that there had been an expedition, and as I say, he became lost, exhausted and famished. I stopped to camp, and he found nothing to eat. Then on the slope right opposite me, I saw an old rock rat come out of his hole. It's something between a field mouse and a groundhog. It came out to warm itself in the sun. Picking up a stone, I smashed its skull with a lucky throw, cooked it over a fire of rhododendrons, and devoured the leathery meat. Then I slept an hour or two and went on down to Portamonkeys, back to the base, you see. A month later, as I was about to start up the mountain again, I was called before the guides' tribunal to answer for the murder of the rat. How they learned about it, I'll never know. The law makes no exceptions. Access to the mountain above Meadowbrook was denied me for 3 years. After that, I could ask to leave with the first caravan on the condition that I make reparations for any damage my action might have caused. It was a numbing blow. I forced myself to set up again in Portamonkeys, and so on. And so he sets up shop and so on. Finally, the day arrives that he can go back to Meadowbrook. I proudly carried with me in a cage a fat rock rat, which I had captured easily, and which I would free as we went by the place where I had killed the other one, for I had to repair the damage. So he thinks that by bringing a similar rock rat back. Alas, the damage had just begun to show. As we left Meadowbrook, just at sunrise, a terrifying sound filled the valley. The entire side of the mountain, which was not then cut through by the waterfall, collapsed and crashed down in an avalanche of rocks and mud. A cataract of water mixed with blocks of ice and stone burst out of the tip of the glacier, which hung down to the upper slope and wore great gullies in the sides of the mountain. The trail, which at that time climbed after leaving Meadowbrook to cross the slope much higher up, was obliterated for a considerable distance. For several days, rock slides and eruptions of water and mud kept occurring, and our path was completely blocked. The caravan went back to Port-a-Monkeys in order to re-equip for unforeseen dangers, and then set out in search of a new trail to the base chalets along the other bank, a long, mean trail on which several men perished. I was not allowed to leave until a commission of guides had determined the causes of the catastrophe. A week later, I was called before the commission, which declared that I was responsible for the disaster, and following the original sentence, would have to repair the damage. I was dumbfounded, but they explained to me how it had all happened according to the findings of the commission. Lords of karma. They made the statement impartially, objectively, and today I would even say leniently, but categorically. The old rat I had killed fed principally on a species of wasp common in that spot. But beyond a certain age, a rock rat is no longer agile enough to catch wasps on the wing. Therefore, he lived for the most part on the sick or weak insects which dragged themselves along the ground and could hardly fly. In this way, he destroyed the wasps that were malformed or carriers of disease. His unsuspecting intervention protected the colonies of these insects from dangerous afflictions spread by heredity or contagion. Once the rat was dead, these afflictions spread rapidly, and by the following spring there was scarcely a wasp left in the region. These wasps, visiting flowers in search of honey, also fertilized them. Without the wasps, a large number of plants, which play an important part in holding the terrain in place, right. So, this simple action, how do we repair the damage? All right, that's as far as chapter 5 goes. Chapter 6, in the notes, it is said, he said that he intended the title of his last chapter was to be, "And you, what do you seek?" So now, in the time that is left between now and lunch, I suggest that you form into perhaps groups of 4 or 5. I don't know how quite to form you into groups of 4 or 5. Discuss how you're going to finish chapter 5. Are they going to stay there or going to start out? What's going to happen in chapter 6? And if that was to be his title, what is contained then in that chapter 7. And then after lunch in our first session together, at least at the beginning of the first session, perhaps we can share some of the ways in which you would conclude Mount Analog. So I think there are a few, we can have several groups talking even in this room, and if necessary, perhaps go just,
Could use the stage.
Yes. Anyway, we'll take the time now to really, as I say, find like here 2 and here 2, that's a nice group of 4, one other, perhaps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that's all right, something like that. All right. Well, I think 4 or 5 in a group is a nice number. And so can we do that? Can you do that without my numbering you off in some formal way? Can you find, sort of turn the chairs around perhaps? And because these chairs are quite movable, turn your chairs around and get together with a small group, and at least you can begin to come over with these people. This afternoon and to share some of your stories. Now I'm going to watch the time rather closely because not every group will be able to share in full the stories they've written, I'm sure, but for 2 reasons. There's so much still to cover. And so I'm going to see that we stop as close to the allotted time as possible, 2:30, or no later than 2:35, or possibly 2:40 if we squeeze it, but no later. That's it. And then we have a final session after that. We'll determine what we do. I know that the groups were very busy. They certainly, all of you, as I moved around, you were discussing rapidly what how you were going to complete your story. How many of you reached the summit of Mount Analog? Oh, well, a few of you made it. How many of you got on to a second camp? Did you get on to a second camp, at least? Well, I'm not sure how many camps there were meant to be either, you see. So, but at least some of you got on to a second camp. A few of you got on to the top of Mount Analog. but not everyone. Well, in order to make this as fair as possible, we'll just ask for volunteers. But it means, I think, standing up and perhaps coming up here so you can be heard and seen and so on. And as I say, you're not going to be able to read your full story, but give us the highlights of the story, and we'll get as many groups as possible. Who would like to begin with this, telling the story of Hugh? Why don't you and your group? Why not? Yes, he was volunteered.
Yes, well, this is very, very difficult, as you can imagine. So, this continuation of chapter 5, isn't it? Well, understand that none of us came up with any real answers. These are just suggestions. And some of them, of course, may be funny, perhaps. For example, you see, I thought up this idea, this is my brainwave. If we use modern technology, we could solve the problem in a jiffy. You see, the whole of life is an illusion, Maya. And anything you see on a film, isn't that illusion? Right, all you've got to do is play it backwards. And all the rocks and the bees and the dead rat would all... and it would all be restored to its pristine glory. Lazy. Simple. Solve all the problems. Anyway, the others didn't like that idea. And they said, the group helping, oh no, that's your term. The group helping Bernard is equal or equivalent to a modification of karma. No, that's our idea, isn't it?
Yes, your idea.
Yes, the group is actually helping the guide to restore all this damage he'd done through killing the rat and all the sequence. So therefore, there's a modification of karma, and there's also service and sacrifice on the behalf of the group, assisting poor old Bernard to restore his damage. After the restoration, Bernard now has the choice to join the ongoing party or staying behind and helping others. Haven't we heard that story before?
Yes.
Right. At the stage where one becomes an adept, this choice can then be made. Stay behind and help humanity, or go onwards to greater glory. So there's an expansion of consciousness in this chapter 5. There's greater awareness. But of course, chapter 6 required imagination, and this is where we were struggling, because you see, we weren't story writers or authors. So here's some of the ideas that were put down. Chapter 6 is the final journey to the summit. Whether you agree with that or not, we'll find out later. Sogol became part of the group. He was a guide first of all at a certain stage, then he became part of the group. So the group became 9. The 8 was turned into 9. He was no longer the guide, but he became part of the group. The next guide brings the total up to 10. The party now reaches this complete number. The cosmos is represented by number 10. The goal is the ultimate reality, as we know. And then, the story, the surface of the story, there's the guide out there at the edge of the wood, which we can see from this clearing, you see, and he's going, cooey, and beckoning us, so we follow, because we know he is a guide. We plunge into the wooded slopes, into the unknown again. We have to forge, in a sense, a pathway, but this pathway appears. It is based on our previous experiences. This is where the storyline becomes weaker and weaker. The vegetation becomes thinner and sparser, as you would imagine on a mountain, ascending to higher altitudes, and we have to have rest for acclimatization at various levels. Eventually, after eons, we burst out to the summit in a fountain of light.
Wonderful. Wonderful. that, now who's coming next?
Oh, I have to follow on my end.
Good, over here. Ruben.
We tried to go through the whole story as quick as we could.
Good.
So we had a bit
You
of
want to come over on this side? They want you. Huh? Good.
we had a bit of discussion about Bernard, but decided his story had finished in chapter 5. He had to wait for his rat to get to the same age as the other rat before he could release it to do its work again. And meanwhile, we had to dig a new pathway up this slope, that the landfall. But what we did find was that the rockfall had released a lot of paradams.
Oh.
They were just sitting there ready to be picked up.
Oh.
And while we built the pathway, we also had to build a new store at Camp 2 for these paradams, because you've got to take them further up with you. And we had to teach others on the way up, so we created a story called Bernard's Folly about killing rats. Our journey upwards, we met another guide who'd come down to meet us, and his name was Amrak. I'll let you work that one out. Yeah. Amrak. A-M-R-A-K. Karma. So, and he said that we had to get these paradams, the store of paradams on the way up. We took those up there and created, we were ready to go from Camp 2 to Camp 3. But the story here was, not only did we create the store of paradams for others to take up with them, we had to take as many as we could carry. They were so heavy. Now they'd got very heavy. And our spiritual ideal of that was that this was a spiritual folly. We left all our physical realities behind, but now we still thought we had to have knowledge before we got enlightenment. And that's what the paradams were an idea of. So when we get to, and by the way, the guide that took us up to Camp 3 is called Sanam. S-A-N-A-S. Sorry, S-A-N-A-M. Yeah, Manas. So when we get to Camp 3, which is the top of the mountain, there's a teacher there whose name is, I don't know how you pronounce it, Durop. Put his booty backwards. And he asked us, and what do you seek? And we said, well, we seek to be released from the need to seek. And he said, well, there's one way to do that. All these heavy paradams you've carried up, you've got to drop into the volcano, which was right at the top of the mountain. And they became just one big lake. But not only that, it was such force that it sucked us right down to the bottom of the mountain. And we found ourselves out at the beginning again. And some ridiculous character called Pierre Sogol was explaining the story again, and we'd apparently been asleep through this journey.
This is marvelous, because this is really exercising the creative imagination, about which I shall be speaking on Wednesday evening, if anybody feels up to coming along then. All right, who started else? Someone here? Yes, Murray.
We got very involved with the plight of Bernard and how he could make right with what he'd done. And we envisaged him being told that he had approximately 20 years of work to do to make up for what he had done. And he felt pretty terrible about this. And I must admit that I'm going to embroider this slightly and leave some things out too, compared with what all the ideas our group came up with. However, he got into this. He decided that he was going to do this job properly, so he started a school for the oncomers, the next wave of journeyers, to train them in the perils of the path and to explain to them things like you don't throw rocks at rats, and so make good of this. This was called the modern wisdom. And in a school that he called the ST, which stands for Save Trees. Well, that's not rats, but anyway. So he worked very hard at this and very diligently, and a school, a definite training process was established there at that encampment. And it did a great deal of good, and he got other people who were more practically minded to do things like recarve and re-establish the path across the sharply naked faces of the rock that had fallen away and all this kind of thing. So they helped to reconstruct that part of the path as well. So it was on a practical level and a teaching level and so on like this. Well, after about 10 years, the commissioners, the commissioners, and especially the manager, the person responsible for the course, the whole climbing program, came and called him into their presence and said, look, you've done a really good job here. You won't have to stay here for 20 years. In fact, if you'd like to stay on another 2 years, we'll admit you to a course of advanced mountain climbing. And he thought, gee. And he felt very relieved at that and very happily and very willingly went along to this course on advanced mountain climbing. So he did, and they initiated him into the secrets of climbing steep ice faces. And what that meant for him is that he didn't have to do the next 5 encampments around the long path. He was able to climb steep ice faces and make very rapid progress at that stage. Well, there our imaginations boggled because it was all way ahead of where we're up to in this path. And I must say it was a great temptation as Theosophist to actually talk about the path and theosophical insights and forget the story but actually get into it in terms of what it is representing. But anyway, one of the great ideas that emerged was that near the end of this, when he accomplished his great and wonderful goal, he was transformed partly by the wonderful air currents, the updraft there again. You might recall that he was carried in through the original doorway by an air current. He was transformed by the air currents at the top of the mountain into a wonderful shower of ice crystals which fell down over the surrounding countryside and nurtured all growth and all life thereabouts. Yeah, that's all.
All right, over here, I think. Yeah.
We start from Bernard's story.
Speak up so they can all hear you.
Because the path was blocked by Bernard for all the others, he had to assist them find a way to assist them past that rough area, the avalanche, where he had to do this for 4 years, carrying these pilgrims across over the damaged way. And then he had to stay at the first camp or go back to get another group and bring them back to first camp. And this sort of symbolises that their physical trials had to be overcome. From the first camp to the second camp, I rewrote it. It's time to move on. Bernard remains. He explains that they will meet trials and that the party will meet on their way a great river with a raging torrent which they must cross at that particular point that they arrive at. If they look very carefully, the way will appear. Finally, the party arrives at this point. No matter how hard they look, they can't find the place. They begin to lose faith and look further afield. One member of the party notices a beautiful hidden valley, and it was suggested that they could find a way through this valley. There they went. They found peace, harmony, contentment, and decided to stay for a period of 7 years. However, some of them began to feel restlessness in their soul, and they realised that by staying in this valley, they were preventing others from moving on. Because if you remember before, one group had to leave as one group left, the others could move on. So they realised that they were preventing others from moving on. So with their faith restored, they were able to cross the stream. They returned to that point where they had left across the stream. And there before them, a bridge appeared, enabling them to cross this torrent. But the bridge was quite low and the torrent was moving over the bridge. And so they had to hang on tight as they crossed. And all their possessions and everything that they had was washed away. The torrent being our emotions and our mental bodies and perhaps karma. So they lose their tools and everything that they have. At the second camp, they can see in the distance the peak of Mount Analog, which now seems reachable. But the party now has no possessions to move on and need to search for more paradigms before they can. This they do, spending many years looking for them. Theodore finds one and puts it in his little bag. He returns to the camp. He feels ready to move on his way, but is unable to do so until the rest of the party have found their pterodons. He becomes restless and impatient, waiting. One day, while the others were searching, a strange person called Fleas appears. He tells a sad story of how he needs to return to base for whatever reason, but has no possessions, no food to get him there. In a moment of sympathy, Theodore gives away his one and only pterodon. What does it matter if he gives it away? The others yet haven't found any. On the return of the rest of the party that night, they have all found a pterodon ready to move on their journey. They can move on their way, but leave him behind. But all is well. Fleas reappears. United with Theodore, they are all ready to move on to the final camp. Fleas being backwards. United with Fleas, they are able to move on to the top peak. There they are able to view the world below. They feel a move to return to the foot of the mountain to help those now beginning their journey and perhaps become a Sogol. Looking far in the distance, a cloud parts. They see a great fertile valley with taller peaks enveloped in a greater light in the distance. This climb has only started, and they realise that this climb has only started. There are many doors to God.
Wonderful. Kevin? It's interesting, you became intrigued with these names spelled backwards, these words spelled backwards.
Don't you start.
Well, I tried very hard to encourage any of the others of our group, but for various reasons I stand elected to this position. And it's rather interesting. We had a bit of difficulty reaching the top of our mountain because we tended to act a little bit like Theosophists, and we spent a lot of time talking about it and not acting sufficiently quickly to gain the appropriate result. However, we realised that reparation had to be made, the mountain in some way had to be restored, so that we worked collectively with Bernard and worked very hard. We re-established the colony of rats so that there wouldn't just be the one rat, and if such an accident occurred where one rat was killed, well, there would be others. So we re-established the colony of rats. We also took up ecology, and we established flowering plants and so forth. And as they flourished, of course, on the mountainside, a path started to appear, partly made by our efforts. And of course, this also gave us time to reflect on many things. And because of the difficulties that we had to overcome in establishing re-establishing the ecology of the area of the mountainside, we realised the consequences of our past over hasty deeds, so that we had become much more aware of the connecting links between all living creatures and every aspect of the environment, and therefore we could now proceed in our further endeavours with less haste and greater wisdom towards our goal. So once again we were ready to start out on our journey. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, the bees were buzzing as we strode on our new journey. Now we were at one with all nature, and nature responded, giving us of her best. We were provided with all the fruits of nature and all good food and a lovely sparkling fountain of fresh water from which we drew strength and were encouraged. But we also discovered that we had to proceed fairly slowly because we needed to be acclimatised, so we didn't rush on our journey, and we tended to linger at times a little because we were the scenery was so wonderful and splendid. However, we bade farewell to other travellers, and in our newfound knowledge we strode forward. But suddenly we came across a deep ravine with crashing water and sharp rocks beneath, and just a fine thread of a swing bridge across this ravine, apparently very frail. Could we, dare we cross the ravine? Our hearts sank, it seemed impassable, and our breath quickened. Blimey. However, we drew on our inner resources. One by one, led and encouraged by Bernard, we gingerly crossed the bridge, experiencing our own feelings, seemingly alone, but aware and sustained by the presence of our fellow travellers. We turned round to thank Bernard after we'd all safely crossed and started to gather again, and he was nowhere to be seen. He was no longer with us, I should say. He was no longer with us. And we realised that on our further journey, we must make that alone, without any other guide than ourselves. So as we stepped forward, oh dear, well, I'm getting a bit lost here, so I think I've covered sufficient to give you the suggestion. We didn't make the top, no, because we had spent too long as Theosophists talking about it, not getting on with it.
Very good. Yes. Fine, Justin.
Okay, well, from the first stage to the second stage, we concentrated on the key. So we basically, as Theosophists, just talked about on that key there. We didn't go much further than to the very top. Basically, Bernard, he, on this problem that he had, started to make a path, even though it was a rough path at first, and from there developed the ecology and the plants and the growing of this. And as time grew, as with the bushes and the trees, and it spread from there to make this a more a centre path, to make it smoother for others also to come along. And so not just for Bernard to travel this path, it had to be for others as well. And so the nourishment that the trees also give the person, so you didn't need to kill the rat, because the trees and the bushes and the fruit that the forest provides along the way nourishes us. So as Bernard travelled on this way, it made it that we help the person, help the forest, and the forest also helps us. So we nourish each other along the path, and so the followers who follow along the path after us, they also again will get nourished from this path, and so we concentrated on that, and that was the main key for us to learn for the other adventures from then on.
Wonderful. Kathy back there, yes. Marvellous how you really began to develop ideas out of this.
Much of our story has been told by other people, so I'd just like to say a couple of points here. We worked on Bernard and his problem at the beginning. In fact, we spent most of our time on Bernard and his problem because it was also our problem. We were there with him. It was our duty to help Bernard and to therefore prepare this encampment for the others who were coming up. And so within that we had to replant. Now we also thought, how are we going to get these plants? So we had to spend a lot of time going and finding seedlings. We also thought that maybe Bernard in his efforts planting something might find a little paradigm, and with that he could go back down and purchase some things to help lay it out and get it right. And within this we're also cutting the path out. We're helping Bernard to cut the path out. So then we also had the second party that Bernard originally belonged to, who were up at the second encampment, start helping to rebuild the path from their end, because it likewise is their duty to make sure that it was there for the next lot to come up. So we met halfway and joined as one. And within this, we then moved on, and Bernard and the two groups together moving on. From that, we really didn't do much, except to say some other things have got to happen. We thought that one of the problems that we might have to face would be dissension within the group. How would we deal with that? How would we overcome this dissension? Maybe the second group were impatient because we'd kept them waiting so long. They wanted to move on faster. Maybe people got a bit hacked off with Bernard because it was his fault. Dissension, what are we going to do? So we had to work through that as one of our trials before we could move on.
Wonderful. I think this is a novel way that not only do you rebuild the path from below, but the group ahead realizes they have to help with the rebuilding in order to be sure there is a path. All right?
Third is through, and Adam is the first man, so it's through the first person as the beginning.
Per Adam, all right? Per Adam, yes. Yeah.
Add something to our little story.
Yes, of course.
Further up the path, of course, we did meet this being called Anna, which, as you realise, is Anna backwards. Of course, the only reason we had Anna in it is because everybody else had these people with these funny names, so we thought we better have one.
You better have one too, so Anna is there. Good, so we have Anna, that's Anna backwards, that's good. Great, all right. This group here, good, Colleen.
Well, we didn't actually spend too much time on Bernard and his problems, partly because we heard that they'd already established another route. A couple of people, in fact, had died in establishing a new route, but there was a new route there. And we decided that Bernard stood for our animal nature, and we need him to go the first step. Then, while respecting him, we no longer allow him to hold us back. So after we'd reached Camp 1, or Camp 5 actually, wasn't it? We then go back and teach all the things we've learned to the people below in order that they may make the journey and to the first camp, and this includes the right equipment, such as courage, perseverance. Then we again return to the first camp, and at that stage we have to let go some excess baggage. And we get a new guide. And this is a Mahatma named Hillary, spelt with one L because that's the feminine way of spelling it. And she has come down from above to guide us. And she has a rope to help to pull us up with, to help pull us up the difficult parts. And she also has a radio link with the top. And she guides us to the 6th camp. At the 6th camp, all our excess baggage has to be let go. From then on, we go on without any of this excess baggage. But again, everyone must return to the 5th camp to help and guide and teach those people and teach other people to take our place. When we again return to the 6th camp, some return to the village of monkeys because they're unable to take that last step. They will gather resources to eventually retrace their steps to the top. The last stage of the journey, each must go alone, for it is the journey of the alone to the alone. Their only guide from then on is within. On the brink of the top of the mountain, one last thing has to be let go. that tiniest shred left of possessiveness. Then, in a blaze of light, we are merged with unconditional love. The mountain erupts and we are blown in a blaze of glory back to the outside world. To help and lead the way for others, full of unconditional love.
Interesting, you're sucked in and you're blown out. Where are any of the others? Oh, good. Charles.
Well, it's a pretty hard act to follow, but never mind, we'll try. Our group was a little bit different because we felt, I think, that this is the story of Theodore. And so here's the pilgrim, and the other people are more or less symbolic and supporting him. So we didn't worry too much about the fate of the unfortunate Bernard, because that was just an incident on the way. He made a karmic error and had to pay the price, and that was an illustration for Theodore to learn from. So when he got up to the camp, the Meadowbrook camp, Theodore was at that stage. Bernard could only take them that far. We've already been told that. So at that point, like our other stories, we get a new guide, and this time it's Theodore's wife, and we decided that her name must be Sophie or Sophia, because he is Theodore, which comes from Theos, you see, which is God, and so the female aspect is Sophia. And Sophia leads the party on to the next stage. They go on through the wood, and they come out on the mountainside above. And at this point, the summit is now visible and possible. But before that, there are some other experiences, because Sophia leads them to a shining pool of ice. And they gather around the pool of ice and they gaze into it. And in this pool, they can see their own past lives right back to the earliest times that they started their journey, however far back that may be in time. And they learn from that all the lessons, or go over the lessons that they have learned in their past lives, and they can see the picture falling into place of the journey that they've been following and how they have arrived at the place that they now are, just below the summit of this marvelous mountain. But of course, you can only spend so much time, or so much duration, looking back over your past lives. And having done that, they became tired, and they looked around for some shelter, and they found a cave. And they went into the cave, and they rested for a while. Quite a long time, actually, but they rested. And then, when they awoke, they found that there was a tunnel at the back of the cave. And they proceeded through the tunnel, and came out to find that it wasn't cold anymore, but warm, and much lighter. And they felt really too warm, so they divested themselves of their outer garments. And finally they divested themselves of all their garments, and they found that they had, underneath this, they had wings. And so, at the same time, Theodore looked around him, and he suddenly became aware that not only did he have wings, but that he was on his own. And yet not on his own, because he could feel not only the companions that he'd come up the mountain with, but a whole host of other beings supporting him, being with him, with which he felt a unity. And so he spread his wings, and he could feel the warmth and the air and the pressure on the pinions of his wings. And it felt wonderful. And he soared, and he soared, and then he found he wasn't making quite as much progress as he would have hoped. There was something else. And he was still carrying his little bag of paradigms. And he didn't want to let it go, so he circled around for a while. But he realized that although the wind was pulling him up, he was just a little bit too heavy to soar with the thermal force of the winds. So he dropped his little bag of paradigms. And at that point, he rose with a rush of wind, was drawn up to the summit of the mountain. And there he experienced a wonderful awakening of understanding. He realized that he was one with the all, the darkness, the light, with the days and the nights of Brahm, and the cycles of incarnation and manifestation and pralaya and manvantara. That all was one, and that he was progressing. And he also felt that this was not the end, this was a beginning. And as he felt this beginning, so the cosmic vision began to dissolve a little. And after a little pause, he felt himself again transformed. And he was in the parlour of the professor with his companions, but one difference. The professor wasn't there. You remember we left him in the journey. And he looked around and he realized that he, Theodore, was now about to lead an expedition to find the wonderful summit of the mountain.
We got others to share. Good. Good.
She's quite right, you know. We were limited to a great extent, and we're a lot shorter than most of these wonderful stories we've heard. But when we've stuck on the side of this mountain and looked at this great pile of rocks that's down there, and we thought, well, what can we do with this? It's no good bringing in seed. We've lost the wasps. The rat itself isn't going to do much without the weak wasp feed on. We can't start off a new ecology chain on our own. We've just got nothing there to do it with. There's absolutely no way through this. And then we thought this is very much in the position that we find ourselves today, because this is a story of where we're at today. This isn't just some other story. This is us here now. We're here in a place where businesses are falling down, countries are splitting up, people are out of work in thousands. We're all at the foot of a great rocky screw-up that we have made through accidents that we have formed. You see, this is where we're at. This is our story, every one of us. And we're sitting here, and it's no good being clever and saying how we can get these plants growing again, how we can get the cowries growing in 50 years instead of 500. We may not be here in 50 years' time. Here, this is where our problem is, right now in this mess, and we've got to get up that slope to the top of the mountain. Then we realize there's not many of us that even want to climb this mountain. There's not many of us even know the mountain's there, it was pointed out to begin with. There's us few here sitting around at the beginning of a catastrophe caused by ourselves, by destroying the atmosphere and our work situations and the rest of it, how to get up it. And we decided there's absolutely nothing we can do for ourselves. We're just not clever enough. We're just not strong enough. There's absolutely no way we can get through this game. All we can do is to go within, ask for help, look for this inner force that built the mountain to begin with, and see that road clear before us. And we felt that that road would clear. Something would be sent. Maybe the pack rat we brought with us would show us a way. Nature would show us a way. All we could do is trust to this inner force, this inner being, God if you like, who will show us one thing at a time. All we had to do was that one thing at a time, trusting, and eventually we would get up the mountain. But I'm afraid we never got to the top of the mountain. Personally, I thought because the mountain was too big and there was no end to it, like God. Further up you get, the more you got. God's limitless, so is this mountain. But we can keep on climbing, but we can't do it out of ourselves. As the Bible says, not by our own strength do we succeed. That's as far as we got.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think we've had some interesting conclusions to this wonderful story. I hope you've enjoyed the day of ascending Mount Analog, whether you got to the top or not. Whether such a mountain exists. Well, it does exist. And remember that at the very beginning, he had postulated, in the story, he had postulated that about Mount Analog, that the summit must be inaccessible, but the base must be accessible. So perhaps inaccessible as we are, we have to change. Some of you had us change. I love the fact that divesting ourselves, we find we have wings, and but we have to drop everything in order to trust ourselves to the air currents, which is trusting ourselves again in many ways. But we've had an adventure today in mountain climbing. This is what Mount Analog is all about. I think there are many lessons to be learned out of this, certainly. René Dalmal was an interesting person. He was, of course, a student of Gurdjieff. He was a Sanskritist, learned Sanskrit. He was a surrealist, a poet, an artist, a very short life, as I indicated, but certainly a tremendous thinker. And this is the last work which he gave to the world. It first became available in English in the late 50s, I believe it was. I came across it first in the 1960s, and just recently, last year in fact, in 1992, they published this, Shambhala Publications brought out this small pocket edition, which really excited me that I could bring it along and share the story with you. Perhaps we're all ascending our own Mount Analog. Perhaps this is the image that we can use. There are many other images, and I've mentioned that we can use many, many different images of this journey, the spiritual life. I'm told that in the Vienna it's the Staatsbibliothek, that there's a very ancient alchemical manuscript, a very old alchemical manuscript, which has never been fully translated, but it's entitled "The Garden Where the Task is Found." I have always thought, well, the content of this is really irrelevant. I really don't even know what the content is, frankly. But here is another image that one can find, the garden where the task is found. This also could be used, and I have used it with groups. Consider, you see, here you were in the first camp, and here is the mountain. But consider the garden where the task is found. We're all of us facing the garden of our own lives, and the garden that is the world. You see, it may be, as was just said, in a bit of a mess right now, this garden. Maybe there are a lot of weeds. You have to consider what is a weed. As you look past the gate that opens into the garden, perhaps it is in disarray. Perhaps your own lives are a bit in disarray. You know, sometimes our lives get that way. A lot of excess stuff is growing there. Vines have sort of creeped around and so on and strangled some of the flowers. Perhaps it's overgrown. How do you begin to bring the garden into order? Here is where the task is found. It's right here, right now, right where we are, either at the base of the mountain, or in the first camp, perhaps, or in the garden, however you want to visualize it. Find your own image, find your own metaphor. If time permits, after our break, we'll talk a bit about another one, but I also want to have time in our last session for any comments and any questions, and maybe we can sort of bring things to an end. it may be that there'll be time to share something of the imagery out of Lucius Apuleius, the transformations of Lucius, otherwise known as the Golden Ass. You might, if you're interested, bring in a little bit of that too. But thank you all for sharing in your groups. As I say, I hope you had fun. It was fun to go around and listen to the groups as you were discussing it. And I was at one point in this reminded, of course, of that wonderful story of the Theosophist who died and eventually got to Devachan, but there was a signpost on the way just before the entrance, and it said, "This way to Devachan, and this way to a lecture about Devachan." Of course, the Theosophist went towards the lecture about Devachan. So perhaps that's what we sometimes do, but maybe we need to see where we're going up the mountain. All right, well, let's take our break then. It's exactly, or almost exactly at 2:30, and we'll be back promptly at 3 o'clock, promptly. I don't think it is, but it's published by Shambhala. I know they're going to try to get copies of it in Australia, so I presume that copies of it can be secured here. Shambhala Publications, I rather imagine. Yes, Ray will do our best to get it. Yes, I don't know, but many of the Shambhala publications, I think, come through divorce, don't they? I'm not sure. Yes, so as I say, it just came out last year, 92, about the middle of the year, so it should be very soon available. All right.